Firstly, I'd like to welcome everyone, including those watching online, to the flooding scrutiny panel. The last meeting we had of this was early March before lockdown, which feels like about half of my life away. So welcome back. It's a strange circumstance to meet everyone in, and please excuse me if the chairing is a little bit clunky at times. So just to start off with, first item on the agenda is substitutes nominated for this meeting and absences. I understand Councillor Courtney is in as a substitute for Councillor Sweeney. Are there any others?
Yes, you have Councillor Allen in for Councillor Greenwood. Okay,
thank you, Councillor Allen. So I couldn't see all the councillors on the same screen there, but yeah, I see you now. The next is members' interest. So if members of the board would be asked if they have any items on the agenda for which they have disclosable pecuniary or other interest, which would prevent them from participating in any discussion on the item or participating in any vote on the matter. Does anyone have any interests they would like to declare at this point? If you think which would prevent them from participating in any discussion on the item or participate. In my own voice, that's horrible. If you do have any particular items, then please let us know if it comes up on the agenda and you suddenly realise that you do have an interest. In terms of admission of the public, obviously there is nowhere to admit them to, but what we do have is we do have the YouTube channel. So if people are watching on YouTube, there's no. We'll then move into item number 5, but that's the minutes of the scrutiny panel held on March the 3rd. If people have any comments, would you mind just commenting write a message in the chat box, just so I can keep up with any comments that people have. Any question, anything on the comments, just say. Councillor Smith.
Yes, the page X16, point number 3. I think it's got a bit confused in the writing up of it. It was the point that was being made was that had the flood alleviation measures been successful, Mythenroyd wouldn't have flooded and all that water would have gone downstream to Sowerby Bridge. So it's just the sort of the reverse of what was actually put in the minutes. And then there's a point on X18, which it just doesn't include Sowerby Bridge as a flood hub. And maybe that's because one of the leaders was coordinating 2 flood hubs, but just to say that as well.
Yeah, Sowerby was mentioned at the meeting, so if we could just make sure that they reflect that, then assuming that change, I'd be happy to support them. Councillor Mrs. Carter.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, it's on the back of that, really. It is common practice now. Well, it is practice now that actually the chairman of meetings don't get to see the minutes when they are done before they are published. It's a long time since our meeting in March, and if anything critical would have needed to be done in that space of time, and the minutes hadn't been as we would want them, as correctly as you would want them to be, then trying to correct them now in July is a pointless exercise. I really don't understand why chairman of meetings no longer get the opportunity to look at the minutes before they are completed and published. This just emphasises the fact that sometimes the wording might not be just as we intended it to be when we'd spoken in a meeting. And so it's just something that I think I would really like us to take forward. I know it's difficult. I know everybody has a different impression of what's been said, but with our meeting and with it's been so important with partners that we do work with closely, I think there should be that clarity should always be there, and the U chair should be given the opportunity to look at those minutes. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Mrs. Carter. What I will say is that from the meeting cabinet, and that included quite a lot from the minutes, although obviously not everything. So there was at least that, and I do understand that the committee staff have been somewhat slimmed down, which is one of the things that unfortunately every councillor here had to well, ended up voting for, because that was the choice that we had to make. Sorry. Yeah, sorry, just to let people know who can't see the comment box, it is going to be raised just as a new process to take up with Ian Hughes, who's head of Democratic Services, and with the leader as well, just to make sure that we do are seeing these things earlier. I think it's particularly pertinent for committees like this, where we meet on a quarterly basis as opposed to the monthly ones. So that's fair enough. Moving on to item number 5. Sorry, hang on. With those changes, everyone happy to move those minutes as a correct record?
Councillor Lee wishes to speak.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair. It was just to emphasise the points made by Councillor Carter, and in fact, at the very end of the minutes, it refers to quite a number of actions that needed to be taken. So it wasn't just a matter of principle, although I totally agree with Geraldine on that. There are a number of things which, because these minutes haven't come out, to my knowledge, that they've not been actioned, and it refers to them all at item number 4 in the minutes, and there are all sorts of things in there. So I think that this is an excellent point, and in these strange circumstances, doing the thing that we used to do would have been the right thing, and this innovation of not showing the chairs of committees the meetings so that things can be done in the meantime is a retrogressive step. So I just wanted to make sure that that was noted, please, Chair.
Yeah, we can. That point can be noted. As I say, I mean, we're coming up to item number 5 on the agenda, which is more specifically looking at the actions recommended in that, and hopefully we'll be questioning the leader about which ones of those have. So maybe we can kind of come on to going through some of that, because obviously the written report of the panel was presented to Cabinet, and we did go through those recommendations at that. But yeah, I do take on board that point. And I think, as I say, particularly this being a quarterly meeting, we should endeavour to get the minutes more quickly seen to. Can I just remind councillors, because of the technology we're using, I can't see everyone at once. So if you do have a comment, if you're able just to say in the chat that you have a comment, then I can much easier pick that up if you just say that you'd like to speak. And if you just say waves hands, that would be great. So moving on to item number 5, which is the report from the scrutiny panel, which we had on the 3rd of March. Let's have a quick look at that and see if we can just go through some of the actions at the end of it, and what's been done in terms of the council work since then. Councillor Swift, are you able to speak on this a little?
Just bear with me a moment, Chair. Yes, I am. So this report went to Cabinet some time ago now, didn't it? Just after the just checking the dates, just after the scrutiny panel meeting, so back in March. Of course, as you say, with COVID intervening in between, then it's easy to forget just how significant and damaging those flooding events were. More recently, the Flood Recovery and Resilience Board, I mean, actually it's met twice. I mean, we met very early on towards the end of March, entirely by telephone. So if anybody's had problems with the technology getting in from Zoom tonight, trust me, trying to chair 25 people on a telephone call is no fun at all. So welcome to Zoom. And then we met again at the end of June. So quite a lot has moved on many of the actions. I think the key parts in the report is probably section 4.5 onwards, and there's a number of points there. I won't go through all of them. There's probably one or two other people want to pick up. I think on the overall scale, I mean, I think a mixed it's a mixed message really here in terms of recognition of the challenges that we face by the government. I think, you know, the two good things is there's been a couple of announcements about resourcing for flooding. There was an announcement as part of the budget. Although some of that we think was perhaps money that we felt had already been promised. And of course, there was the statement earlier this week, which included some additional funding for the Hebden Bridge scheme, and particularly money for uplands and natural flood management, which I suspect Councillor Patient might want to comment on. I think in terms of the response to Calderdale, I think there's been two or three things which have been quite difficult and challenging, though. The first is around the flood resilience grants for properties afterwards, where the government has stuck to the line that these would only be available to properties who didn't have a grant before, which sounds okay in principle, but actually I think many of us know that many properties in Calderdale, the scale of property level work that's required is significantly greater than the £5,000 that was available. That's one point. And secondly, some of the works that were done in post 2015 either were not of great quality and didn't work, or were actually damaged by this time's flooding. So actually there's a significant group of people who need help and are not getting it. The second point is around damage to infrastructure. I think Stephen Lee estimated that the damage to roads and bridges probably, if we include the Canal and Rivers Trust in that, probably was of the order of £8 to £10 million. After the Boxing Day 2015 floods, the government then very quickly allocated a sum of money, which meant that Calderdale was able to get on with that. That didn't happen this time, and that's meant that we've basically had to scrape together funding from various sources, which has both meant money being used for this that can't then be used for other things, and of course has caused delays. And the worst example of that would be the Ellen to Brighouse Road, where I think we have finally identified a way of getting the funding. That's going to Cabinet in August. But that means there's probably been a period of 4 months where it's not been possible to make a start on the work there. And obviously that's quite a very significant scheme. Work is progressing on others. The final point was trying to get the government to recognise that Calderdale is one of a small number of authorities who face an unusual challenge in terms of the frequency of flooding events. This, if you remember, the Chief Executive referred to as getting recognised as kind of a tier 1 level of risk. And again, so far the government's been quite resistant to that. So that's been disappointing, because it then means that we've got ongoing revenue costs which are unique to our situation but aren't recognised in the system. I think those are kind of the overarching things. Just looking then briefly at some of the other points, I think the point about the local plan, that reminds me that earlier I should have passed on Councillor Scullion's apologies, by the way. She's unwell and not able to join us this evening. We had an update at the Resilience Board regarding reservoir management, and I think the Environment Agency are working on with Yorkshire Water on a detailed scheme for how this can be operated going forwards. You've got various reports on the alleviation schemes. And those are details. I will just pick up Park Road Elland. I think both the Chief Executive and I have been very clear with the Environment Agency about the need to reconsider the position on that. And it was reported at the Flood Resilience Board that some revised works are being done looking at the scope of the scheme to try and address the issue there. Obviously, that's only a quick overview because there's quite a lot of detail in that original report, but just did want to emphasise that there is quite a lot of this work is going on.
Thank you for that, Councillor Swift. I know I've got a couple of people who would like to come in. Just quickly, I do. One thing that I think would be quite useful to raise is that one thing that came quite strongly in terms of our recommendations from the meeting is the thing in 4.5.1, which is the tier 1 funding. Now that's at present, I understand the government haven't done that, and that makes particularly some of the kind of the rebuilding work more tricky. Have we got any indication why we've not been seen appropriate for that when, say, like Manchester and London have?
I think it is something we need to pursue further. I mean, there's simply not been a recognition that there are a number of councils in this position. I mean, the tier 1 funding that was referred to in terms of Manchester and London, that's in terms of the terrorism risk. I think the point we've been making is that flooding is recognised on the sort of national resilience risks as one of the 3 big dangers. There are a small number of councils like ourselves who have the risk of very regular flooding incidents, but we don't get the resource for the ongoing revenue costs that imposes on us. So that's a battle we need to continue.
Okay, I've got Councillor Lee wanting to come in, and then Councillor Patient just wants to say a few words. So if Councillor Lee could come in now.
Thank you, Chair. Just in response to Councillor Swift's comments, very important comments they were, and very interesting they were too. However, we were talking about the specific points in item 4 earlier, and the funding aspects hardly came into that thread of conversation at the meeting. It was all about specific activities that could be conducted. And I think 4.6 is relevant, where it refers to you actually on this, Josh. The Flooding and Scrutiny Panel is aiming to arrange a meeting for April. Well, we know what happened, so, you know, no points to be scored there at all. But it refers to you saying you'd like to meet with the leader of the council, the chief exec, or the key cabinet members and officers to discuss a coordinated approach to the work that needs to be done. And that didn't happen for various reasons. But my concern in this right now and at that meeting is I keep thinking to myself, what happens if these weather conditions happened again tonight? You know, what could we do to avoid a flood tonight if it happened? And there's a very limited number of things that can be done in the short term to avert flooding. And some of those were referred to at the meeting. So as far as I know, that meeting that we plan to have in April hasn't happened. There was some talk about this topic at the cabinet meeting. It was kind of guided towards grants and financial aspects, all of which I have said are very important. However, I don't really think that there's no evidence that we've made great progress on the specific points. And time is ebbing away. These floods can happen in the summer as well as the winter. And there are things that could be done to avert a flood, which, as far as I know, have not been looked at properly yet, nor has the liaison with the other agencies occurred. Thank you, Chair.
I'm going to bring in Councillor Patient now. I'll let the councillors on the board then make a few more comments if people have them, and then I'll bring in Councillor Swift towards the end. So, Councillor Patient.
Yeah, I guess I could address some of that, what Councillor Lee was just referring to by perhaps mentioning some of the other opportunities beyond the partnership board meeting. In fact, only last night, we had a really successful community resilience operations group meeting, which also gets a lot of the partners around the room in terms of thinking about what level of resilience and all the other aspects of flood work can happen. In fact, probably the discussion, it wasn't the first time it met either. There's obviously been discussion throughout that time. I think a number of the bits on there were discussed and covered, specifically Councillor Lee just making reference to what if an event happened now. John Beecroft Mitchell, our emergency response officer from the council, was there and specifically spoke about the work he's been doing in terms of making sure we're resilient should such an event happen now, how the hubs might work, actually lessons from how the virtual hubs have worked that sort of came from real life hubs and sort of what we're learning from now whilst they're actually in virtual form. So there's quite a lot of interesting work there, and I think we're about to get a report that will probably come through in the next few weeks or month about exactly what those systems look like in real terms. Uplands and natural, while we're on 4.5.1 in terms of the response, we also spoke quite a bit about mental well-being in terms of volunteers and officers, all the time and effort that was put into these hubs, people literally working round the clock from council staff being brought in from other areas to flood wardens to councillors to everyone that was providing services. And these hubs really were hubs. They were mental health advice, there was environment agency officers there, people from the council, flood wardens and various voluntary groups. So lessons learned from there, but also really thinking about how we might support the voluntary community sector and our officers who are working flat out at those times. Sorry, I'm just going to try and be a bit systematic working through here because I think we've got a bit of info on all of them. Uplands and natural flood management, just to say, obviously this £12 million that Councillor Swift made reference to, we're not currently aware of where that money will be spent, but we certainly hope to bolster the work we've been doing in terms of natural flood management with a decent portion of that amount, whilst obviously providing confidence to the rest of the Hebden Bridge scheme going forward. It's worth noting that our amazing natural flood management officer, Ben Fenton's been doing some really good work in terms of landowner engagement and really getting some of these ordinary watercourse consent bits through as well, working in partnership with the likes of Slow the Flow and other agencies, just to really try and get some of these NFM projects through. Tim mentioned the local plan, the reservoir management. I'll leave Granville to speak a little bit more about that recently, but obviously a lot of lobbying happened around that time and since as well. Flood alleviation engineering schemes. Hebden Bridge, obviously we've got some information that I imagine Paul or maybe Adrian will be pulling on that, but Mythenroyd scheme slipped a little bit, I think, in no small part due to the supply chain issues, but in terms of how they're working, work's coming on a pace. Certainly the new bridge is in, and the demolition of the old one has been completed, and in terms of public realm, that scheme's really starting to take shape now, so that's really good to see. Dredging, I don't think we've got anyone around the table, although I might leave that to other partners to come back with. And the flood hubs we sort of covered, and vulnerable people as well. So if there's anything else specific that need people that people need me to comment, I'm more than willing to. But just to say that an element of those bits that weren't specifically referenced have been covered already.
Yeah, thank you for that, Councillor Patient. In terms of that, we've got quite a useful list there. Later in this meeting, we are going to talk about our workforce planning, our work plan, and it would be quite useful to think about some of the the things that Councillor Patient has just run through for maybe a deeper delve in later. I see that Councillor Carter wants to come in. Councillor Mrs. Carter, beg your pardon. And then Katie had a comment to make. So, Councillor Mrs. Carter.
Thanks, Chair. I was somewhat confused, I have to say, with the agenda, because there was nothing on the agenda about any update from our meeting in March by anybody. The only item on the agenda to look at the flooding scrutiny panel document from March, and then item 6, which was the Marthen Road flood alleviation scheme. If we were going to do some update, I think it would have been useful if we could have had a written report from various people, because I for one, can't possibly remember everything that's been said by everybody with regards to an update from those things. I thought this meeting today was to see where we were going forward, but obviously that's not happening in that way, because there's obviously things been going on in the interim because of the length of time it's been. But it would have been useful to have had an update from various people that sit around the table as to what work's been done since our last meeting in March, rather than it being a verbal report. Because I'm sorry, but I just don't take it all in on the verbal report, especially on the Zoom meeting.
Okay, I mean, I think that point that is well taken, and I mean, I think, you know, we're trying to find a balance here between knowing how busy, particularly some of our emergency response focused officers have been with the with COVID, and also trying to so not wanting to be too onerous on their time, but also trying to get the best information that we can. And I think I will take the message that perhaps we need to do a little bit more work to make sure that we are getting slightly more complete updates rather than just relying on the verbal ones. Katie, you had a comment to make, if that's okay.
Yep, I'll keep it brief.
Katie Kimber.
Can you hear me? Yep.
Can hear you.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, it's around 0.4, 0.5, 10 on vulnerable people. So as Scott mentioned, we had the Community Resilience Operations Group last night, which provided quite a lot of updates, but it did also highlight some gaps that we've got. And at the moment, we are waiting on an audit of health recommendations that came from this scrutiny board back in 2016, so after the Boxing Day floods, and Councillor Carter might be able to help with this, because I think she may have been chair of this group at the time. A set of recommendations were made by the Director of Health at the time from the council, and there were a set of recommendations around health and around vulnerable people, but also around mental health. There was a whole set of recommendations. I've been chasing that audit for quite a while through my group, and we haven't had a clear update. And I suppose it's we've had another flood in the meantime and a few near misses, and could really do with some clarity on that. And with it coming from this group that was then passed through to my group to chase, I could really do with that being pinned down. So I don't know whether Councillor Carter can provide any more information on that, but I can send through the recommendations to you, Josh, for you to have a look at. But it's just that the key point around the vulnerable people there is one of those recommendations on that list that came from public health. So it would be really great just to know that that is all in hand for future flooding. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's useful to know. Yeah, I think particularly that was one of the weaknesses that we identified, and it's good to hear that it's been acted on. Councillor Mrs. Carter.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, just to come back to Katie. I haven't had any updates personally since then. We have had a change of staffing since that meeting when that occurred, and I just wonder whether Mike can pick up on this, and maybe if you could send him those recommendations through, then he knows exactly what he's looking at. It's interesting that one was on vulnerable people, and we've just had this. I mean, I know nobody knew we were going to have COVID-19 and all the issues around it, but needless to say, those were the people that would be the vulnerable people within that COVID-19 scenario. I'll touch wood, not only with my head, because I'm anything else around at the minute. Just to say that let's hope that we don't get flooded in the next week, because we haven't had the update, which, as you say, Katie, is from quite some time ago, with regards to that health issue. And I think it's important that we get it going forward, because as we've been informed again today, the likelihood of this thing attacking us again is stronger rather than weaker, and the likelihood of having a flood could happen until the work gets completely finished and we know we're safe. So it would be useful if somebody could pick that up and run with it, but I haven't had anything further back, Katie, no.
Thank you for that, Geraldine. Councillor Ms. Carter. A few kind of broader questions. I think
You can call me Geraldine, I don't mind.
Thank you. There's been a few broad questions just on kind of both the vulnerable people point and also just how much we've gone up to. I don't expect you to respond to the kind of summarise the 2 resilience boards that we've had since the last meeting all at once, but it would be quite useful talking about where we are in terms of the next sort of level of engineering schemes underway, and also a bit about the and how we're kind of making sure that it is in a way that's cool.
Sorry, Josh, was that? I'm not sure where that closing comment was to me, because you broke.
I was just giving you, sorry, just see if you're able to just come briefly on some of those concerns.
Yeah, well, I mean, just a bit of overview, because I do realise people change roles and come to different things. I suppose question I'd pose back to the panel really is, you know, what you want to cover going forward, because I thought really that the intention was to have a bit of an overview of the issues that were raised in the March report, and then probably identify 2 or 3 things that you wanted to have sort of in-depth reports on at future meetings. I mean, clearly, I know some members will be more aware of others. You know, there is a very substantial set of partnerships that meet and drive forward work in this area, and that have continued to, although a little bit delayed by COVID. So both, you know, Scott touched on the community resilience group. That's one of 4 operational groups that drive forward different elements of the programme. You know, the natural flood management group, the communications group, but particularly one that deals with the you know, the big engineering projects and work, and all of those have continued. So I guess if the group wants a general update, you know, the easiest thing in a sense might be to say, well, you know, do you want to bring the minutes of the resilience board meeting here? But the danger is you then spend a lot of your time rerunning the discussions that have taken place there. But I would urge members to check that if they've got concerns about the work that's going on, you know, have a look at the papers which are online, which give quite a lot of detail on where we are with all the individual schemes. And you've got the update on the Mythenroyd scheme, particularly further on the agenda. I think that so that was my understanding of where you wanted to be, and I just thought it was helpful to give a little bit of an overview going on. But I certainly wouldn't want people to think that there is not work that's continued during there. Clearly, in terms of protecting people as far as possible against a future flood, our long-term ambition is to make sure we have the funding to deliver all of the schemes that have been identified, which we're making progress on. Although when I say we, of course, it's the Environment Agency that are responsible for commissioning and delivering those, but also recognising that no physical engineering scheme will ever guarantee 100% that there will not be flooding. It depends on the scale of things, which is why the work around community resilience and natural flood management are so important, why it's critical that those go ahead. I think there are some specific bits of learning from the from every flood incident, and particularly I know there's been discussions between our officers and agents team about what we need to do to ensure that whilst works are going on, temporary defences are as robust as possible if we do get sudden flooding things. And again, as Scott mentioned, the reassurance whenever there is a weather forecast that suggests there is a risk of abnormal rain and any threat, our emergency plans slot into place alongside those of the Environment Agency, and we are ready to respond as far as possible. I think Mike promised to sort of follow up the mental health and vulnerable people one. Obviously, it's probably not it wouldn't have been a great time over the last couple of months to push those hard, because the same people are rather busy with the coronavirus crisis as well. But I think the work on that continues, and of course the whole shielding process actually has probably helped us have a more up-to-date indication of where vulnerable people are as well, and perhaps given some ideas about different approaches going forward. Sorry, Chair.
Could I just ask you a question on one specific area that is mentioned in the report and came up quite strongly at the meeting on the 3rd of March, and that's the question around Park Road. And it might be that our colleague from the Environment Agency wants to come in on that as well. I mean, in our subsequent meetings, so that we've had a bit of movement, but the conclusion that had been reached before, not to paraphrase too brazenly, was that that the funding simply wasn't effective because so few people live there, and Councillor Pollett was quite vocal in speaking up for those people, as were a couple of the residents there who spoke incredibly movingly about it. I'd just be interested, following on from our meeting on the 3rd of March, if that's been reassessed and where both the Environment Agency and the Council are on looking at possibilities of what we could do to support those, and if there are schemes that are perhaps not quite as costly, which may be able to help that community there in Park Road. So yeah, I'm going to throw that out either to Tim or to Paul, whoever is better to answer that question. Oh, sorry, Adrian, in fact.
It might be, yeah, I mean, as I said in my introduction, I think Robin and I have both been fairly clear that we wanted to see that looked at again, and I understand that's what's happening, but I'll back that onto Adrian, if I may.
That's okay, thank you. Yeah, certainly, since the last meeting, we have been looking again very closely at Park Road Elland. And you're right that previously when we looked at this, we had come to the conclusion that protecting the properties affected was going to be extremely expensive. But a few things have happened, really. One, sadly, whenever there's a flood, that always does change, if you like, our understanding of what can happen in an area, and has again highlighted the risk to Park Road from the river. But also at the same time, our work around Brighouse has been continuing. The modelling work there has further helped inform our understanding of flood risk. And then lastly, again, with the work that the Brighouse team are doing, we did discover that there was an issue with some of the data we had used from the Elland gauging station. So all of those things combined mean we're looking at this again. We have commissioned a consultant now to look at this, and we're expecting them to report later in the year, when we will bring that back to the partnership board to present those findings and to see what can be taken forwards. But I think I guess I would flag at this stage. I think affordability at Park Road will still be a big challenge. So I think, Chair, you made the point about I guess looking at a full range of options and what could be done at the lower end, a more affordable level.
Councillor Mrs. Carter, if you'd like to speak.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah. Following that meeting in March, I made the comments that someone who was a landowner near that area in Elland had offered his support with regards to making it feasible for a scheme to be done, which didn't seem to have been taken on board by either you or Yorkshire Water. I was assured following that last meeting, I can't remember, Adrian, who it was that took over from you at the meeting, because you couldn't stay for the whole time, assured me that he would be contacting the landowner, because we did have a conversation after the meeting and he said he knew exactly who I was talking about. Has that not then taken place? Have we not done anything any further with regards to that offer of maybe a solution with regards to the canal and the river at that point on Park Road with that particular landowner?
So it was Paul who took over from me at that meeting, Councillor Carter. So he's on the call tonight. So I'll ask Paul to come in there to answer that, and if not, we'll have to take that away. Paul, are you able to provide a response to Councillor Carter?
I am, yeah. Good evening, everyone. Councillor Carter, I don't believe I've ever spoken to you after the meeting, so perhaps it wasn't me that you spoke to.
Oh dear, well, was it Yorkshire Water I spoke to then? There was somebody at the meeting that understood exactly what I was talking about with regards to a flood alleviation scheme at Park Road at Elland. That the landowner had said that he could, there's a landowner there that said that he would facilitate some mechanism for the water to get from the canal to the river. So I guess from that day to this, there's nothing any further being done.
Might I suggest, just as a way forward, Katie's just suggested it might have been Canal and Rivers Trust, which may well be the case. But what might be sensible is if through Mike Lodge, you pass the details to Adrian, we can just have a bit of a check to see if that's been sorted, and we can make sure that we do take up those kind of options, because obviously landowners are really key to this. So if that's a way forward that everyone's happy with, would you be able to do that, Mrs. Carter?
Yeah, I think it was. It could have been the Canal and Rivers Trust. Yes, not Environment Agency. Sorry, Adrian.
It's okay.
Could have been the Canal and Rivers Trust.
But we're happy to look into that, Chair. Happy to do that.
Yeah, if you'd pass those details through, Mike, that would be great. Councillor Smith, you wanted to quickly come in there.
Yeah, just to ask, you said that you'd made an error in the data from Elland, Adrian. I'm not sure. Was that in relation to what flood level? Water levels? Because I wondered about, upstream as well. What would be the implications for Sowerby Bridge if there was an error made?
So I might need to defer to another colleague on the call today, Joe Arnold, who's a catchment lead for Calderdale. But my understanding is that we just discovered some discrepancies in that gauging station, which is, when we're taking the whole with the other information that we've got, it's just required us to look at it again. And I think it was more that would be taken into account. But Joe, can you perhaps add a bit more detail so people don't think that we've got a big issue there?
Yeah, of course, yes. So while we've been reviewing the model from the Brighouse the alleviation scheme, so after every major flood event, we will take into account what we know new from that. So based on the flooding in Brighouse, the model has been reviewed, and it did show some errors at the Elland gauge station. So I don't know any more details than that, if I'm totally honest, but that has had an impact on what we think we know in Elland. But it hasn't had any impact on any of the other schemes at all. And you mentioned Sorby Bridge. We are beginning to investigate that scheme, and obviously what we know now regarding the Elland gauge will help with that.
Okay.
So,
Councillor Poet wanted to make a comment at this point.
Yeah, thank you. I just feel like I'm hearing the same story over again, that there's no government money to support Elland, that there's no money to fix the road, that it's the main connector between Elland and Brighouse, that there's not going to be the money to protect the people who live on Park Road. And it just feels like the same story over and over again, that, sorry, Elland, you're not quite big enough and there's not any money. And it's so frustrating. I want to represent the people of my community. And whenever I speak to people who can supposedly make a difference and step in and help us, I'm told that it's not affordable, or we're having to beg for scraps from the government to fix a primary route. I do feel like if it was the Burnley Road that had been washed away by floods, that it would have been fixed by now. But because it's the road between Elland and Brighouse, oh well, you can always go around. You can go through Rastrick. You can go a different way. The roads around here are horrendous at the moment. We've got the bypass being resurfaced as well, which is obviously work that needs to be done. But all of these things knock onto our communities, and the town centre is absolutely rammed with lorries, and we're trying to socially distance, and we can't step into the road because it's full of wagons, and it just feels like, oh well, it's only Elland. And I just really wanted to make that point strongly, that we are a community, we are part of Calderdale, and we can't keep coming second or last or whatever it is. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, strongly heard point. Just checking, do we have anyone else who would wish to speak at this point? So let me just look down my list. Sorry, Councillor Courtney.
I've just noticed though, does Councillor Swift need to want to come back on that first before and answer that before I speak?
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's sensible. Yeah. Councillor Swift.
Okay, well, happy to wait to the end, but I mean, I want to reassure Councillor Porritt that's, you know, that's certainly not the case in terms of Calderdale's view. We've done everything we can to identify the money for this road, but I will, at risk of upsetting one or two people, you know, go back to the original point. You're right. When the Burnley Road was damaged in the Boxing Day floods, we were able to get on and commission the work straight away because the government made the money available to do it straight away. And sadly, that didn't happen with Park Road. So we have had to, I mean, obviously there would needed to be technical investigations anyway to make sure we get the right solution. But it's a significant scheme. But the good news is that there is a report going to Cabinet which will agree the capital so that work can go ahead.
Right, before bringing Councillor Calise indicated he wants to speak specifically on Park Road. So while we're on that subject, I'm going to go with Councillor Lee, and then I'll bring in Councillor Courtney if that's okay. Stephen?
It's not Councillor Lee, it's the other Stephen Lee.
Oh, sorry. I got really confused there. Never get dyslexic to look at things that are written down. Stephen Lee.
No, I was just going to say the recently announced Getting Building Fund, which was announced over the last few weeks, awarded £52 million to Wyke as a whole, and part of the core bid was for repairs to the landslip on Park Road. And so we're very, very hopeful. We're 99.9% certain that by the end of the week, there will be monies identified through that fund specifically for Park Road, which formed a core element of the West Yorkshire bid. But if not, as Councillor Swift says, we have contingency arrangements within the report that's going on August the 3rd to ensure that Park Road will come forward as a capital scheme within this year's capital programme.
Brilliant, thank you for that update. I'm going to go Councillor Courtney, and then maybe we can move on to the discussion of the Mythenwood scheme after that. One thing I would like to just put a marker in when we talk about work plan, if we are allowed to leave the house again, I think it might be useful, given that we've got a big Brig House scheme and we've got the issues around Elland, if we have a meeting at some point in the lower valley, in the same way that we've had a meeting in the upper valley, to kind of look at some of these issues and just make sure that people who are impacted by those schemes or lack of schemes get say and get to be listened to as Courtney.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm glad to hear that there might be some good news there for Elland, because it makes me feel slightly less guilty about talking about some of the money that's just been awarded to the Hebden Bridge scheme. So can I ask, and I guess this is probably to the members of the EA who are here, about does some of this money, I mean, it'd be great, I know that some of it will be going to natural flood management schemes, and that's fantastic and really important in especially for us in the upper valley with our very steep hillsides and everything. But will some of that money help be going to secure the work that's been sort of outlined for Stubbingholme Road, which seems to have had a bit of a yo-yo, like yes, there's funding, no there isn't funding, yes there's funding, no there isn't funding. So can I possibly can I get any information or reassurance that the Stubbingholme Road area bit of the flood alleviation works is going to go ahead, please?
I'm happy to answer that, Chair. So obviously there were a number of announcements made by government yesterday. One of them was an announcement around a pot of money of about £170 million, which was about accelerating schemes, particularly ones which had a business element and protect jobs or create jobs. Within that, that's where the £12 million for Hebden Bridge was announced. Now, unfortunately, we're still awaiting clarification on some of that detail. So I guess I can't say with confidence that we absolutely can guarantee Stubbingholme Road will continue until I have that clarity. But it's my expectation that as a partnership, that is something we would now look to confirm, but that would be a partnership decision. So the £12 million is new money to Hebden Bridge. That was based on a number of requests that Treasury and DEFRA made of the Environment Agency over the last few weeks, and was partly around protecting us against funding bids that we expect to get but have not yet got, but also in recognition of the complexity of the scheme and some of the adjustments we've made to the programme to minimise disruptions to the town. But I am hopeful that this will mean we can now progress with Stubbingholme Road. But like I say, I'm just waiting on a little bit more detail or of any conditions that may be attached to the money, and then taking that for a decision by the partnership to take forward.
Thank you.
I mean, I said yes. Sounded like yes to me. Right, before we move on to the next part of business, I think Mike wants to come in very quickly.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a couple of, I suppose, governance points in a way. One is that we wrote the report for Cabinet very quickly after the meeting on the 3rd of March. I think everybody shared the view that it's better to get it to Cabinet quickly than to wait to present a report to this panel and then take it to Cabinet. We did check the wording of the report out with all members of the scrutiny panel, and a number of you, thank you very much, responded. I would like to ask the panel whether it would consider adopting the report, so we've closed that loop. That was the first point I wanted to make. I think the points that were made about Councillor Swift and Councillor Fenton Glynn meeting, I think that's quite an important thing to happen, because this is a bit different from other scrutiny boards where you've got a resilience board that sits alongside it and talks to our colleague partner organisations, often in the same sort of framework, and making sure that certainly for their benefit, but also for our benefit, we can see a distinction between the role of the two bodies. And thirdly, Councillor Fenton Glynn, to pick up on your point about when we meet in, when we meet in person again, meeting in different localities. I think we can perhaps, I'll take away trying to think imaginatively about if we're still meeting through Zoom, how we can actually have a geographically focused discussion, perhaps by some of the ways we publicise discussions, if the board would find that useful. I'm sure we can use Twitter and the council's comms team to let the public of a particular area know that's going to be the focus for discussion. So yeah, if you would particularly consider approving the report, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, okay. So firstly, may I ask people just to indicate on approving the report. I'm going to propose to accept the report. Can I have a seconder, please? Councillor Courtney. Do I have all those in favour? I mean, I see some hands. Any against? I don't see any hands. Cool. Okay, that's accepted. I'm not 100% sure if we did officially accept the minutes also. So if I could, I'm happy to propose the minutes of the last meeting if I can find a seconder. Councillor Poet, all those in favour with the changes that have been recommended? Thank you. Sorry, just got the way. Next item of business is the Heathermoyd scheme. Who would like to speak to this report?
Chair, it'll be myself, Paul Swales from the Environment Agency.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, hopefully you've all got the report in front of you, or you've had a chance to have a scan through it. So I'm not going to read it verbatim or spend a huge amount of time on it, because it's 7 pages with quite a few photos. But there's so much in there because quite a lot has happened since we last met in March. So the first page is a bit of context to the background and the history of flooding in Mytholmroyd. And then there's a couple of significant photos there showing why we're building the defences in Mytholmroyd following the Boxing Day 15 floods. And then there's a little bit of information around what we're looking, or what we are building, from the current standard of protection to what's going to be completed at the end of the project. A few bullet points around what we are doing, so the new and improved walls, strengthening and waterproofing of existing structures, clearly the big issue of relocating Calderdale Bridge, and also widening the river channel in a number of places. So what we have been doing since March 2020, clearly there might be some questions shortly around sort of the review of the February flooding event on the 9th of February. So we're still reviewing that. As of, or very recently, sort of hot off the press, we've just commissioned a consultant to undertake a review of this flooding event, but in particular around the sources of flooding and the temporary defences. I think we know what happened, but we're looking for some confirmation on that. I think I want to pick up on a point that was made very early. I think it was made with regards to the previous minutes, about the sort of the significance of the flood event. February the 9th was the second highest recorded flood event on the River Calder in Mytholmroyd, and it was about 300 millimetres lower than the Boxing Day 15 event. So I think it just puts into context the severity of the event. And we have a thought that even if the scheme had been completed, it probably would have overtopped, because it did overtop at the completed section of St Michael's Church on the right bank. And also there was other sources of flooding, clearly surface water not being able to escape into the river channel. But that work is still ongoing. And there's been issues around clearly gathering the data, working from home and those sort of things during the ongoing coronavirus. This has had a bit also whilst we're on it, on the coronavirus pandemic, that you'll have probably recently seen at the partnership board that there's been an extension to the programme and we're now looking towards the end of this calendar year. Again, due to primarily the flooding on February the 9th, but also coronavirus, because we've had a number of staff in the early stages self-isolating. And then we've also had an ongoing as well with supplier issues too, getting concrete or stone, or trying to adhere to social distancing measures as well. However, having said that, we've still made significant progress. So if I just run through briefly some of the areas, the first one being Area B, sort of the Vale Upholstery site, that work is nearly finished now. The only bit that's sort of, and you'll see in the picture there that that's the new access ramp alongside the building. But the only bit really now to finish is commissioning of the 2 new floodgates in that area. All the walls, fencing, everything is in there, apart from commissioning the floodgates. Moving upstream from there, so to Area C, St Michael's Church, again, the photos show sort of a lot of the work being completed, and the soft and hard landscaping areas that are now open to the public. And I'd hope you agree that it looks excellent, and it's nice to have those areas finally open to the local community. And sort of you can really see when you're there on site now as well the full effects of the sort of the channel widening. It's been widened by about 8 meters in this location. And we've taken a lot of, until recently, we've taken advantage of the low river level, so being able to undertake a lot of the stone sets in the river channel bed. However, the last couple of weeks that's been halted because river levels have gone up a little bit and unable to work. But yeah, picture 4 on the top of page 4 really shows that area. Just a little bit around the confluence work. We've had to do a little bit of extra work as a result of the February flooding. It scoured out a section at the confluence of Cragbrook, Elfinbrook, and the River Calder. You can see it on the left-hand picture. So we've had to repair that wall. And on the right-hand picture, you've got the sprayed concrete there, and that will be mason clad with stone to blend into the rest of the scheme. Again, that's been halted because you can see there that the river level in Cragbrook, Elfinbrook is a little bit higher than normal. The biggest milestone, Scott, Councillor Patient stole my thunder earlier, but the biggest milestone is the opening of the new bridge on the 18th of May, and the demolition of Calderdale Bridge, which was completed on the 26th of May. Sorry, on the 19th of June. Massive milestone for the scheme, and moving and looking forward, this is probably the area that's going to have the most activity ongoing for the few foreseeable months, because we're going to be widening in this location. And I think only last week and part of this week we finished the piling works in that area, so that's probably the area that's going to have the biggest amount of disruption. And there's a couple of pictures there showing the new bridge and the old bridge being taken out. Another area that's been or had great progress is the area between White Houses and Hawksclough Bridge. And again, this area is nearly finished. That picture on the left is already out of date. The glass panels have been installed behind the terrace properties of White Houses, and we've got some really good feedback from those residents as well. And that wall as well, on the right hand, or picture 10, that wall is nearing completion as well. And a lot of those temporary barriers that you can see with the visqueen over the top, they've been taken out as well. So it really is progressing at pace. Moving down to Area H, Whiteley Clough, this area is complete now, and you can see some pictures there showing the soft landscaping that has been completed. That bank on the left-hand side eventually will grass seed over, or will grass once it takes. Another one, I've mentioned it before, but Councillor Patient's running route is back open at Area I3. So the Brearley Fields Canal spillway is open to the public. You can see a couple of members of the public there walking over the new footbridge, and we've actually started demobilising in this area now. So that picture on the right-hand side is already out of date, because all that machinery is gone. That bright green as well it's no longer like that. That was just a quick hydroseed spray slurry, and that is already beginning to take, I believe, and it's certainly not that sort of turquoise colour it is there. Some other ongoing works, Brearley L1. So these two areas, L1 and L2, are the downstream mitigation. So we raised flood levels in this location as a result of the works in the village. So we had to construct additional defences down at these two locations. Brearley is ongoing with walls, and L2 is virtually complete. So walls, this is particularly around Tillotson Home Bungalows, where Katie Kimber lives. And yeah, the walls are in place, the ramps are in place, and a lot of the garden reinstatement's taking place. Again, you can see some photos at pictures 15 and 16. And then the final area, which we've started, it's probably the only area we've started after the meeting that we had on or in March, is on Cragbrook, Scarbottom Cottages. So that wall is now being constructed, and we've also started installing a lot of the property flood resilience measures in this location on Elphin or Cragbrook. And yeah, because we have had issues around the property flood resilience measures around the specialist storm-miters being furloughed, so they weren't able to fabricate or install the windows and doors, but that has now started. And then a quick forward look at the end. I've sort of mentioned it, but the main area of work is going to be around the already demolished Calderdale Bridge, where we're going to widen that location. We're looking to complete many of the other areas which I've mentioned already: Brearley, Luddenden Foot, Canal Overflow, Green Hill Industrial Estate and White Houses. And then finally, some really good news is that we've been liaising with the Department for Education to look at adding extra resilience, property level resilience, property flood resilience to Burnley Road Academy, and they've recently agreed for us to scope and design the property flood resilience measures for Burnley Road Academy. So that's been instructed now to the contractors VBA to undertake that work. So that'll be fantastic if we can get that work done as part of this existing contract to make the school even better protected. And that's me, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Patient, did you want to come in at the end here?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chair. A bit of an interest in that my youngest goes to Burnley Road Academy, well, for one more day at least. But obviously very, very pleased to hear that about the school. It's only just got back on its feet after being, struck down after its second major flood. So great to see the kids back in for their final few weeks of primary school, but really, really pleased to hear that funding's been unlocked for it, which I think should give the school a lot of confidence going forward as working in tandem with the flood alleviation scheme. So yeah, just a few bits, not least to welcome the end of the piling, which should make my working from home experience a heck of a lot easier going forward. But just wondering a couple of things. You mentioned the review. I'm just wondering how long will that be? Do you have a sort of timeline on that specific element of things? Because people are obviously very interested in lessons learned from February and the time around there. And I guess the other section is, I don't know whether you mentioned Whiteley Clough there. That's a completed section as well. That's sort of looking good and operating well at the moment. But also there are a few concerns around the what's the area now called? It's the cottages next to Elphaborough. I forget the name of that section. I live right near it, so I should know it. Who are
Scarbottom?
No, you mentioned it. It's at the confluence of the Elphin and Burnley Road. It's next to the community centre. What's
Streamside Fold?
Streamside Fold, thank you. Just a few residents. Pardon?
Katie New.
Just a few residents there concerned about the scope of the works, and it might be nothing, but I think they just want some reassurance that that the heights of the walls, etc., a lot of the work happening around it, not least the tying in that you mentioned about the widening, is going to provide that security. I think it's less about the technical aspects and more about the communication aspects that which might need addressing, perhaps in conjunction with your contractor.
Okay, well, there's a few points there, Scott. So I'll come in a couple, and I think Adrian will probably come in on the review side of things. So I did. So to pick up on your second point around Whiteley Clough, I think I did mention that one. So Area H, that work is complete, and yeah, and the road is reopened as well, because the road was shut for a significant amount of time following the February event, and there was also a collapse in the canal or beneath the canal, so Canal and Rivers Trust have sorted that one out. Calderdale Highways have sorted out the road, and we've been able to manage to finish off the culvert overflow, and all the landscaping. Mabel Street's been reinstated, so that's all done. Your final point, yeah, Streamside Fold. I'm not sure who you're referring to in particular, but I've had a few particular. I've had a number of letters in, shall we say, with regards to Streamside Fold, wall levels, wall heights, curb levels, and I am addressing those. But there's quite a few, but they're all pretty much relating to the same issue. So we are aware of that, but I don't believe it's an issue, and I'll try and explain that in my responses back.
Okay, I'm going to get Councillor Lee to come in, and then I think Katie wanted to comment, and then I've got a couple of questions. Councillor Lee?
Thank you, Chair. Quite briefly, I was very interested in Paul's report. I don't have any criticisms at all about the very impressive hard work that's going on there, and very well intentioned and absolutely necessary. So I don't have any criticisms. It would be wrong to pick any holes in that. But as far as this flood scrutiny panel is concerned, I want to ensure that we maintain now some of the focus that we had at the meeting in March. And one of the issues was reservoir management. And I spoke on that in March, and we've had people here in front of this panel, this board, from Yorkshire Water in the past, and they are critical to the ongoing debate, Josh, that we need to have, because all of the talk that we've had since I last spoke this evening has been principally directed at doing the best we can following an event. So there's a presupposition that the water's got down, causing big problems. And one way of addressing that, and I alluded to this earlier, is the reservoir management. If we can hold the water up on the uplands, everybody knows the arguments here, then that can give us the time to just dissipate the water and hold it until all of these excellent new schemes, can definitely cope with the volume of water that eventually comes down. So one thing I would ask you, Chair, to note and agree for the scrutiny group is I believe we must have a session with Yorkshire Water to talk about this very important aspect of controlling the whole situation. And if we can hold it up on the uplands, together with what we're doing to alleviate the difficulties when this water comes downhill, I think that we'll be making good progress. So that would be a suggestion, Josh, that we do decide that we will have a meeting with the top people from Yorkshire Water.
Well, Granville is on this call, assuming that he is still in the room. Yeah, so what I'll say first, Granville, firstly, it'd be quite useful to have a session where we do speak a bit more specifically about the issues around the kind of holding the water further up and some of the upland management work you've done. But just kind of broadly, just I'd like to check. We've had the pilots running with the reservoirs held lower. Do we have kind of more information from those and looking at the last event? And also, is that something that we're continuing with?
Yeah, so thanks, Josh. So we, since the February event, have been working closely with the Environment Agency to help their modelling team to review what happened over the last trial through the last winter, and in particular the events of Storm Kira. Of course, that work is ongoing at present, is not quite complete as yet, but the Environment Agency modellers are working on that. What I would say, I think also, however, is that we've had some really unusual weather this year. We all know about the huge floods that we had and the very, very wet winter that we had through till February, March time. We've then had some exceptionally dry weather through April and into May. And our reservoirs within the Calderdale Valley at that stage got to around about 60% full, which is what we would normally expect them to get to in sort of September time. And I think that has just really illustrated once again the need to make sure that we're taking a really balanced approach to this issue, recognising the absolute vitality of needing to continue to provide the public water supply, whilst also kind of balancing the considerations of use of some of these assets potentially for other things. Alongside that, we've continued to work with the Environment Agency on the engineering proposals that they've got for the Hebden Bridge group of reservoirs to look at potentially making some more permanent changes to those reservoirs to make their management for flood risk balanced with water resources, to make that a more practical thing to achieve. I think just to the broader point around upland management, and perhaps put my NFM kind of operational group hat on at this stage, we have continued to progress with schemes. Obviously, some of those again have been held up with the COVID crisis as we've gone through the last few months. But we've continued to make grant applications out to landowners for delivery of schemes on their land. And I would absolutely echo the point that Councillor Patient made earlier in the meeting around the fantastic work that Ben has been doing as NFM officer to kind of push those schemes forward. Councillor Lee made some reference to funding from Wicker as a part of the overall flood risk ask that Wicker, the combined authority, has been putting to government. There's quite a significant chunk of money in there for natural flood management. And again, we would hope that Calderdale will be in the vanguard of getting some of that money. And then just yesterday with the announcement from government, we've obviously got a further £200 million has been allocated nationally to up to £6 million for each of 25 areas for work related to catchment management, natural flood management, and also sustainable drainage. And that again, we covered this, I think, at the last partnership board meeting with the support of both of the MPs from the region. Clearly, we feel that Calderdale is in a very good position to get some of that allocation as well. Process for that, again, like Adrian said, with some of the other money announced yesterday, the detailed process is yet to be sort of fully understood, but we believe that we will be asked to submit an expression of interest at some point later this year, potentially funded for doing the work required to put that expression of interest together, and then money from that 200 million will become available in April 2021 and to be spent over 6 years. So, I mean, if we get another £6 million out of that to potentially spend on NFM, that is a really significant chunk of money when we're talking about natural flood management type schemes.
Yeah, thank you for that. I've seen that Adrian and Councillor Patient have asked to come in. What I'd say is I think this probably both the Yorkshire Water point and NFM point are things that we need to come on to and have just a slightly more full session on at a future meeting. I think that was the implication of what Councillor Lee was saying.
Apologies, Chair. Sorry to dive back in. Absolutely acknowledge the request for a meeting, and that's certainly something that I will take away. Maybe we can pick up offline in terms of how we arrange that and what the logistics are given the current situation and so on.
Given the state of things, yeah. I mean, I think everything's sort of readjusted for the current baseline at the moment.
I mean, we have previously, we took the partnership board out to some of our reservoirs So, you know, if and when we're able to get out a bit more, if that's the kind of thing that would be of interest to the scrutiny panel, I'm sure we could arrange to do that.
Yeah, I think that might well be useful. I mean, maybe we can look at something, maybe like a kind of half-day session looking at some of these kind of natural flood management techniques and kind of also looking at holding the water. Maybe that's something that we can consider. I know that Katie wanted to come back. I just want to get us back onto the Mythen scheme. I know that Katie wanted to come back on that specifically, and then I've got a couple of questions that I want to ask Katie.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, so it was a quick one around comms. We discussed it in my community resilience group last night. Just making sure that comms around all the schemes really are come out in a timely fashion, and that they're reaching people that are not online as well. You mentioned, I've been in a couple of meetings where you've mentioned these delay, the date slipping on the Mythen scheme, and was expecting a social media meltdown in the Mythen group, which didn't happen. And I just think maybe that it's been very softly, and maybe there needs to be up the ante on the comms, that the end date has been put back to December, and we talked about this at the Flood Partnership Board as well, just preparing the community in how you're going to manage the end bit of the scheme, where they were expecting you to have left the village and you're going to be in the village, but you're not going to be causing massive disruption. Because I think at the moment it's gone very much under the radar. It was on the top of your newsletter, but I think that not to swear, but the poop hasn't probably hit the fan at the moment in terms of that day, and I think it's probably going to hit. So just how are you going to manage that for people that are not online? Because at the moment, obviously, we've got the situation going on, and we're not capturing. I know that through my group, we're not capturing everybody, and I imagine it's the same with all the COVID stuff that's going on. So just we did talk about in the group last night, and Joe did assure us on all the comms, but it was just a bit more reassurance really about that, and specifically the finish date for that scheme, which is obviously may cause some contention.
Yeah, my question sort of relates a bit to that, so I might ask my question kind of probably of Adrian, I'm afraid now, which is, I think the Mythen scheme, I think I want to know a little bit about the review and kind of where we're at with the review, and kind of what some of the main points that we're looking at getting out of it are. But also, I speak partly scrutinising everything, but also partly as a Hebden Bridge councillor, that I'm interested in what's been learnt from the Mythen scheme for the kind of upriver scheme in Hebden Bridge. One thing that seems to be the case is that sometimes the ones which are slightly more tricky in terms of the schemes for you guys to work on are the ones that aren't the kind of the bigger scale ones, but the smaller scale ones. And the Hebden Bridge scheme is a series of smaller scale interventions. I'm just kind of wondering if you know how that's going to be handled, and if there's anything that you're kind of looking at how the Mythen scheme went that you're going to learn and do differently for Hebden Bridge. Now, there's been the date slippage because of recent events, but there's been quite a lot of date slippage anyway. And I think, I don't get the feeling that that's because people have been working particularly slowly. It might be the fact that it was because expectations were set too high. And I'm just wondering, kind of going back to some of the stuff that Katie said, one of the things that seems to have happened better in the second half of the Mythen scheme is the level of communications with the public. So without anticipating all your answers, I'd be interested if you'd take a different approach from the start for communications for the Hebden Bridge scheme, but also what you've learned in terms of making sure that it all runs smoothly. I mean, minimising as far as is possible disruption, but also setting expectations so people know what they've got coming down the road at them. So yeah, it's a bit of a broad question, but I'd be, as I say, interested in what you've learned.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll do my best to answer, but if I miss anything, please, yeah, please feel free to remind me. So, firstly, on the review, which was a question that Councillor Patient also asked, there's a number of elements to the work that we're doing following the flooding in February. I think first thing to say is, I think Paul mentioned we've now commissioned some consultants to support that work, but I wouldn't want anyone to think we have not been active in looking at this since February. Not an excuse, but we have been incredibly busy. Our incident room, actually, because of the flooding that continued throughout February and into the lower air in March, was open right up until lockdown. Then clearly, COVID and lockdown has had an impact on our ability to progress some elements of this. But we have been working very closely, particularly with VBA, around the issue of temporary defences to understand what happened there. As Paul said, we've made some good progress, but we've now reached a point where we need to do some additional work or commission consultants to independently verify some of that. So one element, or a big element, of our review is clearly around the performance of the temporary defences that were in place in the run-up to that event. It's very hard for me to say any more than that at the moment, because what we very much don't want to do is we want to be open and transparent, but we want to make sure that what we're saying is correct. So at the moment, all we can say is we continue to look into that. Once we know more, we will update the board, this panel, this committee, sorry, and the public. In terms of timescales, again, it's hard for me to say, but what I would hope is that within the coming months, so up to 3 months, we will be able to update our position to inform people what we believe happened. Separate to that, or alongside that, should I say, we're obviously working with Calderdale and other partners to feed into the Section 19 report. And so there may be additional questions of the agency that take longer than that, but that's a kind of a dynamic and ongoing kind of conversation with Calderdale about information they need and how we can support the Section 19. So hopefully that answers that question. You've talked about lessons learned from Mythe and Royd and how we're applying that to other schemes, but particularly Hebden Bridge. I think it is fair to say that we have learned lots of lessons from Mythe and Royd, and I would say not just the Environment Agency, but because while we are delivering a number of these big schemes, we don't deliver all of the schemes, and we talk a lot about partnership, and I truly believe we do have a partnership in Calderdale, and that we deliver these schemes together. You mentioned expectations, Chair, and that I think has been a huge issue for us across the entire programme since 2015. The money that we secured and the expectation of government at that time of what we could deliver, and our belief in what we could deliver, was hugely optimistic. One of the big issues with Mythe and Royd is we were effectively on site from day one, regardless of the scheme, in terms of the damage that had occurred to third-party defences and our own defences, and so we almost were on site and we were designing elements as we went. And clearly, while that is good for pace, it does increase the risk that we might get things wrong and there might be abortive work. And clearly that absolutely happened, because we were looking at widening the channel down at Vale Upholstery as well, which subsequently we were unable to do. So there is lots of learning that's taken place in the Mythe and Royd scheme and has already been incorporated in the Hebden Bridge scheme. And sadly, while the start of the Hebden Bridge scheme has been delayed, part of that delay has been learning the lessons from Mythe and Royd and saying, there is just more we need to do before we start on site. There is more engagement that we need to do, and there's more design and investigations that we need to do before we arrive on site and discover some of these problems. So the date has gone back, and the construction programme is longer than we initially thought, again, taking account of some of the complexities and some of the feedback from the community. but that in itself is some of the learning from Mytholmroyd. And I think you had a specific point around engagement. And again, I think as a partnership, we recognise the importance of engagement and community involvement. I can't guarantee we'll get it right, but we are looking to recruit an officer to support engagement, again, on all our work, but particularly Hebden Bridge is the next big scheme, to ensure, again, that we are giving people the information they need and they feel they understand what's happening. But I think Katie's point around the Mytholmroyd scheme delay, it was the top of the newsletter, but people might not have seen it yet. So, I think that, that's a kind of case in point that we can do our best to communicate, but people don't always, unless they're looking for it, they don't always see some of those messages, which is why we got to use a number of different routes and keep trying.
Yeah. Do you have anyone else wishing to come in at this stage? Councillor Patient, you wanted to add something a little earlier. Are you still?
It was mostly covered, I think, in terms of the review that you came round to, and I guess just picking up a little bit about the. You also spoke a little bit about the 200 million for the innovative flood fund that I wanted to come on to. I was just trying to piece together some of that, but obviously you've sort of made reference to it. It might be a little easier, I guess, just so the scrutiny panel might understand. What mechanisms do we have in place as a partnership to be thinking about where some of those allocations might go? Do you have, for example, what might be considered shovel-ready projects, or what's that outreach looking like in terms of talking to Ben and the wider NFM group for projects that we might support?
So again, I think the resilience programme, the 200 million, is another element of the announcement where we're expecting further detail to be kind of confirmed. But my understanding is that they will be inviting bids, whether that will be through the Environment Agency or DEFRA, I'm not sure. But we'll be inviting bids for locations to come forward to sort of trial and innovate and evaluate actions that places can take together to improve resilience to flooding and coastal change. Now, a lot of the conversations I've had with national colleagues and DEFRA over recent months is that the national strategy that was launched yesterday and the funding that's been announced around that. My point has always been that Calderdale and the Calderdale Partnership and the work that we're doing is the national strategy. We are delivering traditional methods, measures because we need to. We are looking at catchment-wide approach because that's what everybody wants, and we recognise that's an important part of it. There's incredible kind of community awareness of flood risk and knowledge about the catchment. And we're looking at infrastructure resilience, partnership working contributions. I think we are the embodiment of the national strategy. So I've tried to make the case internally that I think we should be able to bid into this this resilience fund, not necessarily to trial and innovate, but simply to do more of what we're doing and push on to the next level. And do more of what we're doing. So within that 200 million, there will be a bidding process for 25 areas or locations. But there's also been an announcement. I hesitate slightly as to whether this has been announced, but there are also nationally 4 locations that will be the focus of what's being termed adapted pathways. Now they will be focused around the Thames and Humber estuaries, the Severn estuary and Yorkshire. So clearly, the geography of Yorkshire is pretty significant, but it's the only area that isn't focused around an estuary itself. And for me, again, awaiting more details, but I think that is recognition, if you like, of the flooding that we have experienced in recent years, and the work that we need to do as an area, as a region. And I would like to think that Calderdale within that can position itself very strongly in terms of bidding into some of this further money. But until we see the detail and exactly how it, what the criteria are, it's hard to say.
That's really good to hear. Just it was somewhat frustrating, I guess. I mean, obviously COVID's happened, but I think we were likely to have a flood summit up here after the flood event, and obviously that got somewhat derailed. I think we were likely the location for that as well. So that's good to hear that there's some other opportunities, because I think our partners, like with Most of the Future and Slow the Flow, etc., they know that these works aren't trials, that they're proven. And with groups like that, you know what ward funding, grant funding is like, it's feast or famine. So if there could be some transformative amount of money you put in a good place to support them. Sorry, that's my dog in the background, just like squeaking at me. Sorry, I've basically finished what I was saying. Thank you.
I think we'll all be disappointed if we've not seen your dog by the end of this meeting, Scott. Granville, you wanted to come in on this point.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, just to build, I guess, on what Adrian's said and what Councillor Patience just said as well. My understanding of the mechanism at the moment is that for bidding into this 200 million and the 6 million per area is that it would be Lead Local Flood Authority led with EA invitation. So obviously Lead Local Flood Authority for Calderdale is Calderdale Council. So I think in terms of the route, it will be something that we would do through the council and obviously through the partnership board into the Environment Agency. But there's also an emphasis on working with local partners to put that bid together and that expression of interest together. And I think that's probably where we come to kind of Councillor Patience's point around engagement with local community groups who've got really good understanding of what happens on the ground and who've got really good kind of connections and routes into the landowners around the Upper Valley, well, around the valley as a whole, but in particular, I guess, the Upper Valley when it comes to natural flood management. And what I would say, I think also is that there's probably a slightly bigger picture strategic view there as well in terms of the role that Yorkshire Water and other major landowners, the likes of National Trust, have got to play in terms of helping to kind of contribute into that partnership right the way across all of the land holding. So yeah, I think just to your point, Councillor Patient, Ben is also very much in touch with the likes of Slow the Flow and others to look at what the forward programme could be given additional funding. Clearly at the moment we're at a place where we've pretty much spent the funding that has been allocated to natural flood management, but yeah, if substantial further money is to come, then I think we're well placed to make those connections and identify the schemes that can go forward. I think just to finally say on that, however, probably back to Adrian's point about being a local version of what the national strategy is saying, this needs to be about every measure in combination. It needs to, it can't just be about natural flood management or reservoirs for that matter. It's about how all of these measures cumulatively can help to lower the flood risk within the valley bottom.
Thank you for that. Adrian, I can see you waving, and thank you for ignoring the being heckled by the dog there as well.
It's okay. It's very quickly. Apologies. I've just read something about timings, and it is the intention that a programme prospectus and invitations for expressions of interest will be published in the autumn, with the intention that the projects will be announced by Christmas 2020. So just to give people a feel for the timescales around that pot of money. That's what I've got in front of me, obviously subject to change. And then I think lastly, just picking up on Granville's point that NFM funding has been allocated, that may be something that the Resilience Board needs to review. If we believe now there is more demand for that funding, because at one point we allocated some money, but obviously there was a lot of work to do to identify sites and get people to come forward. But if we now at a stage where we've got sites, but it's a lack of funding, then I think we should have another conversation at the Resilience Board to see whether more funding can be secured through other routes or from the partnership itself.
Yeah, I think maybe that's, kind of looking at bids around that or something like that is something that we might want to think about in terms of future work for this committee as well. I'm not seeing anyone else wishing to come in unless I've missed anything. I don't think I've missed anything in the chat window. So I might just quickly move us on to what we can do in terms of future meetings. Now, there's been some points raised during this meeting. I think actually one thing that was raised by Councillor Lee, but just also building on what Adrian said, might be quite a useful thing, which is that thing about everything working together and making all the partners work together, but also how that fits into the new national framework. And I think maybe that's a piece of, essentially I can see two pieces of work. One is specifically on the Lower Valley issues, so Elland and Brighouse. And one's a bit more about how we can all work together, how we can, both kind of from natural flood management, reservoirs, but also Environment Agency, and then Calderdale as the lead agency, all work together and making sure that we're kind of putting together the best bids, and also kind of some of the, learning from what we do very well, just as we're moving forward to the prospectus coming out and the kind of potential bids coming out in the autumn and then over into by Christmas. So I'm wondering kind of, what the mood is, and do people think that actually this is something that we can really add? And if this is something that we can really add, maybe we could tie that in with the potential of kind of doing a half-day thing where we visit one of the reservoirs as part of that as well. So I'm throwing those thoughts out there and hoping that Mike can translate that into English. I can hear a pause. Mike, are you there?
Sorry, I was just unmuting. Yes, of course I can, and I think I'll try and produce a summary, if I may, of the discussion and the things that we might look forward, particularly that last item. And I think it may be useful, if members agree, to have a sort of a schedule of what the Resilience Board is doing and what the Scrutiny Panel plans to do, so that people can see that side by side, so they can see where the two bodies are picking up different bits of work. And bearing in mind, I mean, I think the point about all about how, picking up on Councillor Lee's point about how everyone's working together, one of your prime roles as a scrutiny panel is in fact to scrutinise the partnership, to check it's working properly. So that would sound like a really good piece of work for you to do, perhaps in the autumn, as we move into this sort of next stage. Finished.
Okay. Anyone wish to comment further? In terms of timings, I know this is kind of bi-monthly, every 3 months usually. I'm wondering when you think might make sense for us to get back together as a committee.
Are you asking me, Chair?
I'm asking anyone who wants to answer. Stephen, I see you've raised your hand.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I think in view of the discussions we've had this evening, I think that it would be very useful if we could pick up the various items that were referred to in the minutes of the March meeting and ask for written reports to be circulated to this board, if not to a bigger audience, so that we can have an in-depth update of where we are on each of those items. And then I would suggest that we bring our next meeting forward as far as possible after having received those reports, so that we can reintroduce some of the vigour and passion that we heard at that meeting and demonstrate that we're taking this dead seriously and we're doing our best to do things and satisfy the requirements of all those people at that great meeting that are very concerned that they're not seeing action. And it is disconcerting that we've not made the progress, in my view, that we might have done during this period of COVID-19, but that's a terrible thing that's happened. And, a lot of us have had our minds elsewhere because of it. But I do think it's time to rattle on now with this and get a meeting as soon as we can after we've seen some reports. Thanks, Chair.
So Kind of moving on from that, might I suggest that we have a meeting, so it's, yeah, July now, maybe early in September, and we try with that meeting to have perhaps a slightly longer one, where we do look at how things work together, but also at the bidding system for this next round of funding, and maybe we incorporate the potential visit to the reservoirs to see kind of what's been done there in that meeting. Would that be something that we could do? I'm seeing nods, so I'm taking that as assent. Councillor Patient, you're waving at me.
Chair, with just a suggestion, that timing might work well if the following meeting from there was around the Christmas period, which would be two things: perhaps the results of that expressions of interest, and also perhaps even an opportunity for members of this panel to go and visit the Maidenroyd scheme, which should be completed at around that point, and sort of see the nature of the work going forward, as other schemes are thinking about beginning.
My only thing about having the Maidenroyd scheme in 2 meetings' time is that I want one of the next 2 meetings to be in the Lower Valley, potentially in Elland or Brighouse. So it might be that the Maidenroyd scheme has to wait till the new year. It's one of those difficulties. I essentially want to do everything at once, but I also recognise this isn't a monthly panel. Councillor Lee, I see you've unmuted your microphone. Did you want to comment?
Well, just thank you, Chair. Just on a positive note, I've just been appointed to the Wicker Authority as a member, and so I can assure you, putting all politics to one side here, we've got a strong representation on that Wicker Authority, and I look forward very much to working with Tim Swift to argue the case for funding for Calderdale, and so, you know, we'll be shooting, you know, from the hip there as well. We really want to do the very best we can for this wonderful borough, and yeah, so I'm thrilled about that, and that must be good for our chances of unlocking a bit more funding if Tim's not there on his own doing his very best, as I'm sure he always does. I'll be alongside him, working in unison and not in a divisive manner. So I think that's also good for us all.
That's good to hear.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Smith, just can I remind people it's better if you go through the chat box, because I can only see 4 councillors at the moment rather than everyone. So, but Councillor Smith, I did see you raise your hand. So yeah, please go ahead.
I'd just like a reminder that Sowerby Bridge would also like a visit as well, because we had a number of properties flooded and a huge amount of disruption with the roads being closed, including the new road that runs along the back of Milner Road.
Yeah. Strong point. And I think, yeah, I mean, as I say, it's that trying to do everything at once, really. But yeah, no, it is something that we should do. I mean, the meeting in Halifax was kind of open to quite people from all over, but yeah, so I think we've had 2 in the Upper Valley. So I think, yeah, getting up and down as much as we can and kind of out and about within the confines of the current situation would be something that I think we're all keen to do. Okay, I'm going to propose, based on the silence, that we do go ahead with that. So we have a specific meeting on looking at how we can tie up the different ways of working, and potentially we look at a longer meeting, but also if we look at the potential for, you know, the upcoming bids and how we can support Calderdale in that. And we have that maybe early September. And then I'm going to propose that the meeting after that is somewhere either in the Lower Valley or targeted at the Lower Valley, where we try to get an idea of what can be done, and hopefully have a bit more clarity around Park Road by then, both in terms of resilience and rebuilding, but also in terms of what possible schemes there are there. I'm seeing nods. If I take it to a vote, is everyone happy with that? Can I see some hands, please? Great, fantastic. In that case, let's push forward with that. And I think that brings us to the end of our agenda. Is there anything I've forgotten to do at this stage, Mike?
I don't think so, Chair, except to remind members that Stephen Lee produced a briefing report that was circulated earlier today on the government announcements this week that you may not have seen yet, but should be in your inboxes to have a look at.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for your time. Good evening.
Chair, it's just a two-pager that gives you a brief summary, and I'd like to thank Jo, although she doesn't know she helped. I copied her detail on the funding straight onto the bottom of it, so it gives you a breakdown of the 5 areas that the government's looking at as part of the policy, and it gives a brief breakdown of where the areas of funding come in.
Thank you, Jo, for being plagiarised and not complaining. Brilliant. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a good evening.